The machine that is running on top right here is my Power Computing PowerBase 200. Power Computing was one of the major manufacturers of Macintosh clones, which is exactly what this is. It's a 603E based system. I believe that it shipped with 16 megabytes of memory, although this one obviously has been upgraded, as I think most of them have. It's got 90 megabytes in it right now, maybe 92. I'm pretty sure it's 90 megabytes, somewhere around there. Would have shipped with like a 1.2 or a 2 gigabyte hard drive. It's got a 1 gigabyte drive in it right now that I'm probably going to have to replace because I think that drive is now suffering from stiction issues, but I don't exactly have any low-capacity hard drives that I want to put into one of these. Most of my low-capacity drives are, well, low-capacity, like a couple hundred megabytes. And that's a little bit small for something of this age, which would have been produced in 1996 or thereabouts. The reason why this clone is here is so that we can compare and contrast to the actual genuine Apple computer that is sitting underneath it. The machine that was Apple's response to the Macintosh clones that, until that point, were basically just all doing nothing but eating Apple's lunch. Because they could produce machines like this that were much cheaper in price point. I think the PowerBase 200 would have sold for around either $1,800 or right around the $2,000 mark. Apple's computers were quite a bit more expensive. Things like the 7200, 7100, 8100, things that would have been around at that time, and these are also quite a bit faster than what Apple was usually managing with those machines. They took the Tanzania board, which is not what's in this Power Computing. The Power Computing actually, I think, has a Tsunami board, or maybe it's an Alchemy. I don't remember which. But they took the Tanzania board that was used primarily in the Motorola StarMax and threw that into what is basically nothing more than a PC clone case. You can see they look very similar. With what is effectively a PC-based power supply. Now, it's obviously a little bit proprietary, so you couldn't put a standard baby AT power supply in one of these or anything like that. Not the least of which is because it's got soft power on, but it's also got some additional connectors and other varying things. In essence, what they did was they built a Motorola StarMax 3200 DT and replaced the faceplate with one that has an Apple logo. That's basically essentially what this machine is. The Power Macintosh 4400, in this case the 4400-200. There was also a 4400-166 that was sold in Europe. That was the first version. There was the 4400-200 PC, which would have had a PC compatibility card. And then there was the 7220, which is the same machine, just with a different model number, because in some Eastern countries, the number 4 happens to be extremely unlucky. The Power Macintosh 4400, that is right here, was released in March of 1997. At least this particular model. I'm not thinking about the 166 that came before it. That was slightly different, but mostly the same. And, you know, March of 1997 would have put it smack in the middle of the clone era at Apple, for Apple, at a time when, as I mentioned before, the clone manufacturers were doing nothing but eating Apple's lunch, with machines that were priced cheaper and had better performance specifications. The 4400-200 was supposed to address that. Now, I'm going to have to rephrase some earlier statements that I made about this PowerBase 200. It actually sold for $1,500, not $1,800 to $2,000. The 4400 sold for $1,800. I'm reading from this article here that was published in MacWeek on February 17th of 1997. That time is probably accurate. It talks about the machine here and what it would have shipped with originally. 16 megabytes of memory, 2 megabytes of video memory. It actually shipped with the cache slot populated with the level 2 cache, 2 gigabyte IDE hard drive, an 8-speed CD-ROM, and built-in Ethernet, which actually is something that the 4400 166 did not necessarily have. Or maybe it did. The difference between the 166 and the 200, basically, and I can't show you this because unfortunately my example is actually missing the PCI riser, is it exchanged the one PCI slot for a COM2 slot with an Ethernet card put into it. You can see there some models that would have been around at the time. StarMax 3200, the PowerBase 200 from Power Computing, APS Technologies 603E200, and of course the UMax SuperMax C600 200, all of which were desktop-style machines. From the standpoint of an Apple Macintosh, this is a very vast departure in that it is basically nothing more than a PC-style case with a PC-style power supply, with some proprietary connections obviously, but the thing that you'll note is that just like the Power Computing here, it actually has a switch on the back to go from 115 to 230 volts. Most Macintoshes implemented that automatically. So that was another cost-saving option that Apple took. You will notice that even though this is actually basically a clone motherboard, based on the, I think I might have mentioned it, the Tanzania architecture, there is no VGA, and there is no PS2 ports, like the clones would have had. I'm not sure why Apple removed them, other than maybe to lock you into their ecosystem. The Power Macintosh 4400 is basically nothing more than a clone with an Apple logo on it. As mentioned, it's a Motorola StarMax 3200 DT. It uses the same motherboard, or I guess logic board in Apple parlance. It's the same basic case, although I think it is definitely slightly different. I used to have a Motorola StarMax, and I remember the StarMax being a little bit smaller with a slightly, where the floppy drive was actually more towards the middle, just like this Power Computing design up here. As far as an Apple Macintosh goes, it's a very rapid and very stark departure from what they usually did. And this was the only time they ever did this, because it didn't really work. The clones still were outselling Apple's machines, even at the low end. But it was certainly a valiant try. It's not like these were terrible machines when they were brand new. But being based on the clone board, they have the same problem that the clones had. In particular, these Tanzania-based machines. Supposedly, they won't start without a dead battery, and I know that the Motorola that I had did not. This one is. It does not have a good battery on it, but yet it still turns on and functions, so I don't know what's up there. If maybe this is a slightly revised design. Unlike these Tsunami-based boards, which use the lithium thionyl chloride depth charge battery, these actually have a 4.5 volt lithium box. Sorry, alkaline box, not lithium. Wow, that little Rayovac. I used to have one sitting around here somewhere that came out of my 5200. May it rest in peace. But it uses that. So these are a lot easier to actually replace the batteries on. I mean, you can still get the 3.6 volt lithium thionyl chloride batteries for these, but I don't know for how much longer. And I put a new battery in this one, and apparently it's already dead, so I don't know what's up with that. I might have to check what I've got. Maybe see if I can find a better supplier for them, because I just bought them off of eBay. You can kind of see inside there, and you can see that, yes, my riser's missing, so I don't have my... What would have been here would have been the Ethernet card that it would have shipped with. And obviously it doesn't have that, so I'll have to find a slot cover somewhere. And I probably have one, and I'll put that in there so that way at least there's no open gaps in the machine. As mentioned, this does have just the Apple video connector, the DB15. It does not have the HD15 VGA that the clones had. So I've got this adapter here. This is not ideal. I should probably get the adapter that actually doesn't have these on it so it can auto-detect what the monitor is, because that should work on these. Although I've definitely had some problems with those and random monitors over the years. So I'll go ahead and I'll shut this clone down, get this out of the way, and then we'll pop the cover on this and have a look inside. If you want to see inside the clone, this Power Computing, you can go ahead and watch that video. I'm not going to pull it apart right now, even though, as I mentioned, I'm going to have to because I have to replace the battery. Real quick, as an aside, I did actually pull the cover off of this power base. There you can see the riser. I believe it is mostly the same. However, it has the video right there, where the Tanzania boards have the video on the main board. You can see this has one SCSI and one IDE, and of course the floppy connection. There's the, what I believe is the cache slot there, the Valkyrie, whatever. I don't know how you're supposed to totally pronounce that, but there you go. And no battery. I realized I actually pulled it before I put it into storage, which is something that you should always do, because those lithium thionyl chloride batteries are ticking time bombs if you let them die and sit there. Like I said, I'm working on a theory that what happens is the lithium, as it degrades, causes the case to expand, and once the case expands, the thionyl chloride reacts with humidity and moisture in the air to create hydrochloric acid, and it does so rather violently, which is why they blow up. Okay, with the clone out of the way, I've gone ahead and popped the cover on the genuine article. I don't know if you can really call it that, because it's still the Tanzania board. It's not like it's any different from any other Tanzania system. I'm glad that I don't need the riser in order to have the video like I would have with that power computing machine. You can see the video is just right there. Interestingly, it looks like it was made in Malta. You'll never see that on anything anymore. Not really sure what chip it is. Suppose I could look that up. The system's a little bit dusty, but not too bad. But you can see that it's very similar to that clone. It's just the difference is that this would be the so-called Tanzania architecture, as opposed to the other one, which is Tsunami, I believe. So there's some differences. There's nothing called a Valkyrie slot, which would be their cache. This one does, of course, have the cache DIMM installed. I believe that's the stock 256K. This machine is basically mostly stock. I think the only thing that was ever upgraded on this was the memory, because as you can see there, it's got 64 mags. I'm actually curious, because it's got more DIMMs in here. The system's got 80 megabytes of installed memory, so I guess it must just not be seeing one of those memory modules. Kind of odd. What's this? Let me take this module out. Yeah, these are not matched. So that is... I don't know what that is. It doesn't really say on it. When you can see there, 3.3 volts. That's also important on systems like this. Let me see if I can put that back. I don't know, maybe something's loose, and I just need to loosen it up. I'll put that in the right way. That might be a good idea. Because on something like this, you might actually break it. It might be brittle enough to break. But, being based on the Tanzania board, this uses 3.3 volt DIMMs like all the other Tanzania-based systems. You cannot use the 5 volt ones, which were the standard at the time. So that's one annoyance with these 4400s. The other annoyance is that there were issues, well, not so much with this, because Apple chose to thwart it by including a COM2 slot and a COM2-based Ethernet card. But there were problems with various PCI Ethernet cards on these, and probably other PCI cards as well, just compatibility problems. You know, odd kind of things. It was almost like the Packard Bell of the Macintosh world, where as soon as you tried to change its stock configuration, you ran into weird problems that you never really could fully solve. And I mentioned earlier, I did have a Motorola StarMax back in the day, and that system had all kinds of weird issues. Before finally the hard drive quit, and then shortly after that the battery stopped working, and at that point it wouldn't turn on anymore. But like I said, interestingly enough, you can see right there is where the battery would be on this system. There is obviously no battery installed, but yet this turns on and works just fine. You can see more proprietariness down there with the power supply. I believe that the reason why they did that is because this board requires 3.3 volts off of the power supply, and the AT standard did not provide 3.3 volts. If you remember baby AT, didn't have that. Now, ATX got rid of the minus 12, but that's neither here nor there. So this has a plus 3.3 volt, where a baby AT power supply would not. It's an ACBEL power supply, and there's the model number there, if you happen to be looking for one of these. There's the hard drive mounted sideways. Again, I believe this is the stock hard drive. It's a 2.1 gigabyte Quantum Fireball. IDE, of course. Sorry, 2 gigabytes. Although it's a 2.1 AT, so I guess there's one thing. Unformatted, it's 2.1. Now, the other interesting thing about this is you can see here, this is a tappy CD-ROM. It's not SCSI. So again, that tends to lend itself to the cheaper nature of this machine. Now, if you wanted to add a SCSI drive, you certainly could do so. If I'm looking on here, this should have a SCSI connection on it. And yeah, there's a SCSI ribbon right there that goes to the external connection right there. So you could replace that with a ribbon if you wanted to, but you'd lose your external SCSI. And that also does not supply termination power, which is another thing that you'd have to look out for on this if you wanted to use SCSI. But, you know, given the prevalence of IDE optical drives, and I don't believe that they need to have Apple firmware in order to work. That's only an issue on some older machines. Might not even have been a problem by the time these PCI PowerMax came out, but I know that it was an issue for the longest time. The Apple HDSC setup would not see anything other than a disk with an Apple firmware on it. The 603E, my understanding is underneath that little heat spreader right there. You can see there IERC 6031U, which tends to lend itself to the fact that that's where the CPU happens to be. You'll notice it's soldered. It's not upgradable. That was another thing with these Tanzania-based systems. There were no official upgrades made available from Apple for the CPU. You were stuck with what you got. Fortunately, there were vendors that went out and managed to manufacture upgrades that would stick into this level 2 cache slot, and you could get your upgrades that way. But man, what a pain. Not much else to really say about it, other than the fact that it's this weird hodgepodge of PC-compatible parts in a Macintosh. Basically, as I mentioned at the start of the video, a Mac clone with the Apple badge on it instead of Motorola. So, anyway, in particular, this would basically be a Motorola StarMax 3200 DT. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'll put the cover back on, which is very much an art. This case is kind of messed up, but, you know, when it comes down to machines like this, they weren't very popular. Oh, and that reminds me of another limitation. These shipped with System 753, and you could not run anything later on them for the longest time, until Apple finally came out with System 7.6, or a patched version of System 7.6, might have been 7.6.1, which you could run on these, but they will not run System 7.5.5, which is what the latest version at the time was, because they were missing system enablers and other various things. It was a mess for people who bought Motorola clones and these PowerMac 4400s. So you really ended up with quite the hampered machine here. Apple kept these on the market as their low-end entry-level machine basically until the Power Macintosh G3 came out, the beige one, which used a more traditional Apple case. They never revisited this idea. Wow, that is unnecessarily difficult. I don't know why it's so difficult to put the case back on this. It must just be because it's a little bit screwed up. Anyway, as mentioned on the back here, there's your Apple monitor port, which I've got this adapter plugged into. Hard set for 1024 by 768. Speaker, microphone, 2 Apple serial ports. The one on the right is GeoPort compatible, I believe, which is why it's got that modem symbol. The other one is not. It's just standard Apple serial. 1 ADB port, and of course the SCSI up there, which plugs directly into the bus. So really, you didn't get any SCSI at all internally, unless you did some refiguring and wanted to get rid of that external SCSI port. Or maybe you could add it, graft it on if you really wanted to, if you needed it. Now, The one interesting thing about these Tanzania-based systems is that they have a slightly different chime. Very short, isn't it? Now, this keyboard is a little bit screwed up, unfortunately. See if it actually detects my video. There we go. Is the mouse working? No, this keyboard is definitely screwed up. I think the port on it's a little broken. Okay, as you can see, this is now running macOS 9.1. I'm not keeping OS 9.1 on here because it's obvious to me that OS 9 is maybe a little bit much for this machine. I did get the keyboard working, or at least I got the mouse working. I don't know about the keyboard. I think the keyboard is still a little messed up, but it's too bad too. That's actually a fairly nice keyboard. It's got Alp switches. So, I think the port on the side there is messed up, and that's why it doesn't work. About this Mac, about this computer, you can see there, 80 megabytes of memory, which again, I'm kind of surprised to see. I don't know why it's only got 80 megabytes, but that's okay. It would have shipped with 16, so there's almost certainly a 16 megabyte DIMM in there somewhere, because I don't think it's got soldered memory. So I'll have to look into the memory on this thing at some point and figure out why it is the way that it is. Of course, the date and time is wrong because there's no battery. I don't really care. So, go to the system profiler here. You can see no active enabler because it doesn't need one for this newer version of the Mac OS. Virtual memory, built-in memory, but it doesn't really tell us a whole lot about it. See all the other information. Keyboard type is a PS2 keyboard. Again, probably because it's not actually detecting my keyboard properly. Come over here to devices and model on volumes. There's the hard drive, 2100A, 2 gigabytes formatted. I believe that's a Panasonic CD-ROM drive, CR583, yeah, almost certainly a Panasonic. There's your video information. And the attached display, which is not running at native resolution. Which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't know if the floppy drive actually works. But, this is not a totally stock install. This is obviously an upgrade that was done at some point. You can see there's an old system folder in here. My belief, or what I was able to find on the system, from what I was able to find on the system, suggests that this had OS 8.5 on it at some point. I'm not sure why multiprocessing thing would be on there, but it's there. It's possible this hard drive came out of something else. But yeah, this doesn't have really a whole lot of anything on it. This mouse is not very good either. I think the sensor in it's not very good, but then again, I don't have it on a proper surface either. So go ahead and I'll reboot it, and I'll let you see the full boot up process, because I had to interrupt it to fix that keyboard. We'll listen to the chime again. I believe that the volume on this is turned all the way up. Yes. So it doesn't go up any higher than that. Like most of these Macintoshes, the onboard speaker is not very good. But it's what we have to work with, so it's what we'll use. Okay, I'll consider it fully loaded there. So, we'll take a quick look at the front of the machine here. So you can see another oddity that I found on this, but it's more of a cosmetic one. Check out that power button. Giant LED in the middle of that. That's also very un-Apple-like. You know, usually they had a power LED on the bottom or something similar, but the speaker's under there. So, the optical drive does eject. I haven't tested it. I don't know if it works. Although I will be testing it at some point, because I'm probably going to install OS 8.1 on this. I think that would be a little bit more better suited to a machine like this. It's a new enough version of the Mac OS. But it's also, I mean, Mac OS 8 really wasn't used by a whole lot of people. You know, most folks went from System 7 straight to Mac OS 9. But it shipped with 7.5.3. I think that's a little bit old for this. 7.5.5 will not run. You cannot get them to run 7.5.5 at all. Unless you hack it together, and I really don't feel like wasting that kind of time. The other clone ran 7.6. Sorry, the clone ran 7.6. This isn't a clone. I mean, it is, but it's not, as I mentioned before. I might put 7.6.1 on this. I haven't really decided yet, but it's certainly not going to keep macOS 9. I think that's a little bit too old for it. So anyway, that's pretty much it for this video of the Odd Duck Power Macintosh 4400. Bit of a rare beast. Can't say I've seen too many of them or heard of too many of them. If somebody's got a lead on a riser card for one of these, I would like to hear from you. But I'm not going to make it a terrifically high priority because I don't necessarily have a need other than maybe installing an Ethernet card for anything on that riser anyway. And I can live without Ethernet on this. I've got 1,000 other Macintoshes that have got networking that I can do my experiments with. And we'll leave it at that. Thanks for watching. If you got any comments, feel free to leave them down below.